Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Apologies that my hits and losses video out earlier today was a couple of hours late. I forgot to press go. Oops. Right, I'm going to talk to you about what's been going on with regard to the peace negotiations and the pressure being put on Zelensky from the Americans, particularly in terms of signing a deal as soon as possible. And I think this is all unrealistic when you're talking about the future of future existence of a country. You can't just agree to something on a telephone call with Steve Witkoff, agree to sign away the Donbass and be done with it. This takes an awful lot of toing and froing. There should be, agreed positions between, say, Europe and Ukraine it really shouldn't be going to the Americans to go to Russia. It should go to Russia, and then that should come back, and that's how you do a deal, and back and back and back and forth. And these things take time, necessarily so. But the idea that I think Donald Trump wants this wrapped up by Christmas is so unfair. It's just not how these very important matters should be conducted. Anyway, there you go. We'll talk about this in more detail first. Of course, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. Keep ahead of what's going on in Ukraine by getting notifications of the channel's output. Let's go and find out what has indeed been going on. We're going to go first to Andrew Perpetua, who reacts to Alex Bruzovitz. Well, in fact, let's go to Alex Bruzovitz first, who his bio reads Christian, Trump advisor, CEO of X-Strategist LLC, America at first. So America first always. So he sees himself as a Christian first, a Trump advisor second, and then CEO of X-Strategies. I don't know if that has anything to do with X, Twitter. But anyway, he said here, Zelensky is doing his country, our country, and the entire world, quite frankly, a disservice by not taking peace talks seriously. The idea that he hadn't read the peace proposal, as according to Donald Trump. And of course, we know, or at least we understand, that's because they were worried about wiretapping, since everyone has been wiretapped recently. They've been bugged and these phone calls have been leaked, so he wanted to speak to the people in person, and that's absolutely fine, understandable. And the delay was only sort of a day, but of course, because Trump wants this done by Christmas, then there's all this pressure, this false, I think, well, it's real pressure, but under false kind of, or not particularly rational justification. There's all this pressure for Zelensky to sign this as soon as possible. Andrew Perpetua replies to Bruzovitz and says, the United States, and he's an American himself, needs significant reforms so people this stupid cannot be advisors to the president in the future. Advisors should pass some sort of minimum intelligence test, maybe win a debate against the cabbage or something. Can he solve a puzzle faster than a pile of sand? Brutal. Okay, so let's get into the finer details here of these peace negotiations. Axios has reported that Trump envoys pushed Zelensky for more immediate consent to cede Ukrainian territory to Russia. After meeting Putin in Moscow, their peace proposal worsened, offering tougher terms on territorial concessions and control over the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, sidestepping security guarantees. Now, I've said this to you before, but the idea is that Witkoff and Kushner went to Moscow to speak to people in the Kremlin with regard to what the US and Ukraine had agreed upon, but essentially came away with a much worse situation. Now, this to and fro, you're obviously going to get some agreement from each side and then disagreement, and like, no, we're not going to accept that. You need to propose this to the other side. So it's necessarily going to be a worse version of what they were intending, the Ukrainians, you would think. But I think the Russians are so obstinate in their red lines that they are just going straight back to the Americans. No, this. The Americans then dutifully go back to the Ukrainians and say, no, they say they do want all of Donbass. And the Ukrainians are like, no, we've very clearly expressed to you and explained why we can't just give up territory that hasn't been conquered by these imperialists. But anyway, that's the situation. And, it includes not just the Donbass, but apparently Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant as well. Just really ridiculous demands from the Russians there. And then we have Trump has given Zelensky just days to respond to the US-backed peace proposal. Trump wants a deal by Christmas. That is indeed what the Financial Times has been reporting, which, as mentioned, that is completely unrealistic, I think, or unfair. Russians are now boasting about Trump being on their side. So this is Lavrov speaking recently, in fairly controversially, said that the only Western leader to care about human rights in Ukraine is President Trump. Of course, that's absolute nonsense. He then blamed the EU for changing the agreement to call Ukraine to comply with EU human rights policies. Feel the difference, Lavrov said. Matvinenko's face behind him speaks volumes, says Anton Gerashenko. But the nature of the beast here is that the US is very much aligning itself with Russia. I don't want to speak too much more on the national security strategy, but it keeps rearing its ugly head, and it's being talked about an awful lot in particularly the British press at the moment. I assume that's the same case in wider Europe, because it does look like the USA has pivoted and has eschewed 80 years of alliance with Europe and has been kind of rather genteel about the Russian Federation in this security document whilst going to town on the Europeans. And it is really worrying Europeans, and rightly so. And then when this is taken advantage of by Russian propagandists and Russian politicians, when they say we completely agree with what Elon Musk is saying about the EU, and we think that this national security strategy is aligned far more with the Russian view, you have to start worrying. Euromaidan Press here says Russia continues to reject any compromises to end its war against Ukraine. A senior Kremlin lawmaker said it doesn't matter who signs the capitulation, quote, capitulation, as long as the terms, quote, satisfy Russia. In other words, Russia wants to be satisfied, and that satisfaction comes when the document enforces the capitulation of Ukraine. He dismissed Ukraine's role entirely, claiming peace should be made with the US instead. So the Russians are saying we need to be making peace with the Americans without Ukraine, but it is about Ukraine, and it's about the complete capitulation of Ukraine. And only when we get that will Russia be satisfied. And the Americans say, okay, it sounds good to us. And by the Americans, of course, I mean the Trump administration. The Kremlin also insists that negotiations happen in silence, a move the Institute for the Study of War sees as a way to hide its rejection of peace plans. So back to Lavrov. Despite the need to recognize realities, London, Brussels, and most NATO and EU states continue to take a destructive stance on Ukraine, still clinging to the illusion of defeating us. Any hostile step, including stationing troops in Ukraine or seizing Russian assets, will be answered. In other words, not only can you not use Russian assets for reparations or to get Ukraine back on track, you cannot have foreign troops stationed in Ukraine, again cementing that position, which means that you can't have any realistic security guarantees. It's crazy, this. And if the Americans the Trump administration agrees to this, then really the Trump administration might as well just don the Russian tricolor and put on a Russian hat and then pretend to be a bear, because they are doing nothing but regurgitating and advocating for Russian talking points. Ukraine has accepted all 6 proposals presented by Trump, while Russia has accepted 0. And this is what Joe Wilson, a Republican representative, I believe, has said. Ukraine has accepted all 6 proposals presented by President Trump this year. Russia has accepted 0. Putin is mocking President Trump and buying time to keep killing Ukrainian families, ensuring hundreds of thousands more Russian men die in trenches for perverted lies. He's absolutely right. Tendar says Ukraine has done everything possible to end the war. Even the majority of Republicans understand that. Like the congressman from South Carolina, Joe Wilson, we see another episode why appeasement never leads to peace. Okay. Meanwhile, we have the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN, who is Andriy Melnyk, saying you'll get the whole from a bagel, not Ukraine, said Ukraine's permanent representative to the UN, addressing Russia at the Security Council meeting. Our land and sovereignty are not for sale. This isn't a Christmas market or some shady bazaar. Love it. That's exactly what needs to be said. Katerina Lisanova here says, Zelensky, the new plan has changed according to European interests. Well, actually, this is a Wall Street Journal she's quoting from. So Wall Street Journal asks Zelensky, what are the main differences between Umarov's plan, the Ukrainian position, and what European NSAs in Ukraine worked out today? So, what has changed? I presume with the plan as it is sent back to the Russians. First of all, he said the NSA from E3 worked together with Ukraine. So these three, I presume E3 is Merz, Macron, and Starmer. And there are several European colleagues who are very important to include. Certainly the NSA, the EU, and NATO NSA. I presume that's national security advisors and apparatus, are important because some issues concern not just Europe, but specifically the European Union. This includes money, our future EU membership, and asset freezing. We want them to join in. We are already joining. So how that plan differs from what we worked on, the points specifically relating to Europe must be accepted, confirmed by Europe. Now, this is really, really, really important. And I talked about this maybe a month or so ago. I haven't really mentioned it since. The idea that, as according to the Russians, this negotiation between Ukraine and Russia should only be done between Russia and the US, right? So it doesn't include Ukraine for a start. Well, that's insane. And it doesn't include Europe, but it doesn't include the EU more specifically. It's not just insane, but you can't do it because there are ramifications for negotiations between Ukraine and Russia that directly affect the EU. In fact, they can't be done unless the EU agrees to X and Y and Z, or it can't be done because it will invalidate the EU's X, Y, or Z, right? So it's actually not just nice for the EU to be involved in these negotiations. It's actually completely necessary that they are involved because these things involve the EU from a practical legislative point of view. So yeah, it's very important that Zelensky expresses that. Zelensky on a possible meeting with Trump this week. So he said that we will be in contact with the US. We are ready for any date. So he's ready to meet with the US. He also announced the meetings with European colleagues and Americans at various levels going forward. Now, Antonio Costa, the one of the heads in the European Union, European Council, I think, if others have doubts about continuing to support Ukraine, the EU will continue to support it unconditionally and will not do what others did in Afghanistan. This is huge rhetoric here from the EU, and I think it's absolutely necessary that he says stuff like this. This is really good to hear, which is despite what you're hearing from the United States and despite all the pressures we're going to be under, we're not going to do in Afghanistan, and we are going to support Ukraine, unconditionally. And it's going to be up to Ukraine as to whether they give up their land. We'll support them if they decide to do it, but we'll support them if they decide not to do it as well. Costa stressed that only Ukraine can make decisions on territorial concessions, and other countries must respect this. We have Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, saying we are quite close to a peace agreement. Now, I don't know whether the word quite does a lot of heavy lifting here or whether indeed Stubb is actually saying, no, we're pretty close. Things have moved along an awful long way. Alexander Stubb, who's as close to Trump as any EU leader, said they're negotiating on 3 separate documents. And this is very important. So there are 3 things going on here, it appears. A 20-point peace plan that's been reduced from 28 points to 20, but also security guarantees and also reconstruction of Ukraine. And it's massively important to understand that Ukraine really can't sign up to any peace negotiation, peace plan, like a 20-point peace plan. They can't sign up to that unless they get robust security guarantees. And I'm afraid the US is going to be a part of that. And if they're not, then actually that makes things far more complicated, far more difficult to agree to, and practically far more challenging because you're not going to have the military might of the United States acting as both a deterrent and, as a security guarantee. There's a lot to work out there. So 3 really big areas of negotiations here. Now, the Washington Post says the US, Ukraine, and European partners are discussing a new 20-point peace plan, which includes a demilitarized zone that would be created along the entire ceasefire line, Behind the demilitarized zone, there will be a deeper buffer zone where heavy weapons would be banned. One option is a Korean-style situation, and we'll just look at some more of this. So just first of all, here we can see the opinion piece by David Ignatius in the Washington Post, I presume there. The outlines of a sustainable Ukraine peace deal inch into view. So it's now starting to form a little bit more. Fixed line of separation, political status of contested territories postponed. The Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant would not remain under Russian control. The US may take over management of the facility to ensure security. Ukraine's EU membership is targeted for 2027, with the US pressuring Hungary to lift its veto. Membership is expected to boost trade, investment, and tighten control over systemic corruption within Ukraine. The US would provide security guarantees similar to NATO's Article 5 protection. Ukraine wants these guarantees to be formally ratified by the US Congress, which stops, obviously, Trump unilaterally opting out of security guarantees for Ukraine. Ukraine's sovereignty would be protected by the Russian veto power in future security arrangements, protected from any Russian veto power. Ukraine's army proposal suggests raising the cap from 600,000 to 800,000 troops. Ukraine rejects any formal restrictions on its military. The administration of Donald Trump proposes using 100 billion in frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine's reconstruction. This amount could increase significantly. Now, I'm interested in what the phrase Donald Trump proposes using, because this shouldn't be money used for the enrichment of Donald Trump, his extended family, or the United States of America. US officials are talking with BlackRock and the World Bank about setting up a Ukrainian development fund. This could attract up to $400 billion for rebuilding Ukraine. Trump reportedly wants similar large-scale investments for Russia as well. Oh, yeah. So Russia get all the support and investments from the outside world because they invaded Ukraine. Yeah, I find that somewhat distasteful. So anyway, we have this Washington Post piece that is looking at the idea that Ukraine might want a Korean-style demilitarized zone from Donetsk to Kherson, frozen front lines, NATO Article 5 style security guarantees, Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant possibly under US control, EU having the Ukraine acceding to it by 2027. Which is very, very quick. I don't think there's realistically a chance before 2030, but what do I know? And $100 billion in frozen rebuilding assets, with more coming potentially from other sources. And there we go. That's where we're sort of up to at the moment. You've had interestingly, the Pope coming out and talking about the security guarantee. I'll probably talk about this separately. And you've got European leaders, including Starmer, Macron. They will meet and I presume Merz in Berlin on Monday to discuss a Ukraine peace plan. Merz has said European security interests must be safeguarded. Against this backdrop, we plan further coordination talks in the coming days. I think that is what you are. The backdrop of not just these discussions, the negotiations over the peace in Ukraine, but also over the national security strategy from the US, means that European leaders are having to think very carefully about their words. Friedrich Merz was probably the most robust in his distaste for what was written in national security strategy. We've got, as mentioned, the Pope coming out and saying, it's looking like they're trying to drive a wedge between themselves, the US themselves, and Europe. Macron, let's face it, he's not going to be French president beyond 2027, so he can probably afford to be a little bit more risque with his rhetoric. And then you've got, of course, Keir Starmer trying to tread this very difficult path between, the US and the EU, but also there was a vote yesterday in the House of Commons on joining the customs union in the EU and a new bill there. And he rejoining the customs union then might mean a renegotiation of the trade deal that he's just signed with the US, which has actually been fairly good for the UK and comparatively, in comparison to the EU. And the British have done an all right job on that. I'd like to know what the details of the tech industry is there, but nonetheless, it's not bad. Keir Starmer's done all right, but rejoining the customs union, might mess around with that, and then how does that play with Trump? And you're starting to see Keir Starmer not overtly saying as many nice things in public about Trump directly as he has done previously. Not nice things, but tipping his hat to Trump in the way that everyone feels they have to. And I think that national security strategy has seen the European leaders start to be a little cooler in their rhetoric concerning Trump, because they see it as a pretty bellicose approach to Europe. Anyway, that's enough from me just on what's going on. This is an update as to what's been happening. And I guess, we'll have to wait to see how this all sits with the Russians, and then they'll just, turn it down, and then it'd be back to the Americans, whether they see Russia at fault or Ukraine at fault for being obstinate. Guaranteed Trump will see Ukraine at fault for being obstinate, for not giving up all of their country to Russia, because they have no cards, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, that's enough for me. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Speak to you soon.